Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we arrive at a quiet doorway into the life of Socrates and into the simple, persistent questions he left behind. What did he believe in, really, and why did his ideas outlast the city that judged him? We will move slowly through that old world, through Athens, through conversation, through doubt, and through the calm little habit of asking one more question. If these late-night journeys help you settle, you might like the video, subscribe gently, or leave a comment with where you're listening from tonight, or what subject you'd like to drift into next. For now, let the room grow softer around you. Let the day loosen its grip. And as we begin, imagine a lamp in an Athenian room, a few voices nearby, and a man who believed that an examined life mattered more than an easy one. Athens is easier to picture in the evening. The hard outlines of the day soften a little. Dust settles on stone. Footsteps sound less urgent. Somewhere beyond the walls, the light on the hills begins to fade, and the city seems to remember its own age. Socrates lived in that city, but he did not live like a man trying to become grand. He was not known for fine clothes or for polishing his image or for arranging himself carefully in the way powerful men often do. By the accounts that survive, he looked plain. He walked. He talked. He asked questions. That may sound small, but in the life of a city, small things can last a very long time. When people ask what Socrates believed in, there is no single tidy sentence that solves it. The problem is that he wrote almost nothing himself. Most of what we know comes through others, especially Plato, Xenophon, and the comic playwright Aristophanes, who all saw different versions of him. So even in the beginning, we are listening through layers. A voice inside another voice, and then another. That too feels somehow fitting. Still, some ideas come through clearly, like moonlight through a thin curtain. Socrates believed that wisdom begins with knowing how little we know. He believed that a careless life could look busy and still be empty. He believed that a person should care for the soul, not in a purely religious sense, but as the inward life, the moral life, the part of us that chooses what sort of person we will become. That word soul can sound distant now, but in Socrates it is very near. It is the center of the self, the place where character grows. He seemed to believe that wealth, status, and applause were secondary things, not useless perhaps, but light in the hand compared with virtue. Virtue was the thing that mattered. Goodness, justice, courage, self-control, a kind of inward steadiness. And yet he did not offer these as decorations for a speech. He tested them. He worried them like a bead between his fingers. If someone claimed to know what courage was, Socrates would ask them to define it. If they said justice, he would ask again. If they were certain, he would gently disturb their certainty, not to humiliate them, but to see whether it could hold its shape under pressure. This is one of the quietest and most important parts of his life. He believed that people often think they understand things simply because the words are familiar, but familiarity is not the same as knowledge. A word can live in the mouth for years and still remain unexplored. Socrates spent his life noticing that gap. He believed, in a way that still feels strangely modern, that honest confusion is better than false confidence, not because confusion is pleasant, but because it is a beginning. A doorway. Once you admit you do not know, you can begin to look carefully. You can begin to listen. The mind becomes less like a sealed room and more like a window opened in the dark. One of the most famous lines ever linked to Socrates is the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. It is a sentence that has been repeated so often that it can almost sound like a slogan, but if you let it sit quietly for a moment, it becomes much more tender than that. To examine a life is not necessarily to judge it harshly. It is not a demand for perfection. It is more like sitting by a small fire and looking carefully at what has been gathered there. What do we value? Why do we choose one thing over another? What do we call good, and do our actions agree with our words? Socrates seemed to believe that these questions are not extra, they are central. He lived among people who cared deeply about reputation, political standing, education, winning arguments, and speaking well in public. Athens was a brilliant city, but also a noisy one, filled with ambition and confidence. In such a place, Socrates was unusual because he kept returning to the simple things beneath the polished ones. What is justice? What is bravery? What is piety? What is a good life? These are not small questions, but he often approached them in a small way, one conversation at a time. He was said to speak with craftsmen, poets, soldiers, politicians, and young men in the streets and public spaces of the city. He did not lecture so much as inquire. He walked beside people, verbally speaking, gently turning the subject over and over until the worn edges of opinion began to show. He believed that a person can be clever and still be mistaken. He believed that many people are guided by habit, social pressure, and the desire to appear wise. So he tried by questions to reveal what was hidden even in plain sight. Not secret doctrine exactly, more like neglected thought. This kind of philosophy can feel quiet enough for the night because it does not demand a sudden leap. It asks for patience. It asks for attention. It asks for the willingness to say, perhaps I may be wrong, or I do not yet understand, or tell me more. In his view, the soul improves when it is in conversation with truth, even if the truth is uncomfortable. That is why he annoyed people, not because he sought conflict, but because he would not allow people to rest too quickly in easy answers. He believed that comfort without clarity was a poor bargain, and still, there is kindness in that sternness. He seems to have thought that the goal of questioning was not to tear a person down, but to make room for something steadier. If false confidence is like sleepwalking, then examination is the moment of waking, not all at once, just enough to see where the path might be. He also seemed to believe that wisdom and virtue are linked, that to know the good is, in some sense, to be drawn toward it. This idea can sound simple until you try to live it. People know many things and still act against them. Socrates knew that too, which is why his questions often reached beyond facts and into the habits of desire, fear, pride, and self-deception. He wanted not just information but transformation. He wanted a better kind of person, and perhaps a better kind of city, built from better questions. There is something calming, oddly enough, about a mind that does not rush to close the case. Socrates appears to have believed that many things worth knowing remain partly open, and that this openness is not a weakness. It is a form of honesty. He had a way of bringing discussion back to the ground. A claim would rise up, elegant and confident, and then he would ask for an example or a definition or a reason. The conversation would slow down. The speaker would pause. A little crack would appear in the polished surface of certainty, and through that crack a stranger kind of thinking could enter. If you imagine a room in Athens, warm with the late light of the day, you might picture men leaning against a wall, or sitting on low stools, or standing in a circle while the talk goes back and forth. Socrates would not necessarily seem important at first glance. That too may have been part of his effect. He looked ordinary enough to approach, and then somehow the conversation became more serious than anyone expected. He believed that the better part of a person is not measured by birth or money or office. In a society that valued rank, this must have been unsettling. He seemed to imply that the highest human task is moral and intellectual, not social. What matters is whether you are becoming more just, more truthful, more self-possessed. There is also in Socrates a special attention to self-control, not the cold kind, more the kind that allows a person to choose rather than simply react. To remain awake inside one's own life. He may have believed that being ruled by appetite or vanity is a form of inner disorder, like a household where every room is speaking at once, and yet he did not appear to demand a monastic withdrawal from the world. He was in the city. He listened to the city. He argued in it, joked in it, irritated it, and served in it as a soldier when called upon. His philosophy was not sealed off from ordinary life. It was threaded through it. That is one reason he remains so strangely present. He does not come to us as a distant oracle who floats above the street. He comes as someone who stayed in the street and asked what the street was for. He seemed to believe that virtue is not accidental. It is cultivated. It may grow slowly through reflection, practice, correction, and the willingness to be challenged. A person does not simply wake up wise like a house lit by sunrise. Wisdom is more deliberate than that. It is made through attention. Even the form of his teaching suggests this. He did not hand people a finished doctrine and send them away. He led them into uncertainty and let them feel where their own assumptions gave out. That can be unsettling, but it can also be merciful. If you discover that your certainty was paper-thin, you may be spared from building your life on it. Socrates also seems to have believed that the search for truth is a shared activity. It happens between people. In speech, in listening, in correction. This is perhaps why his legacy feels alive rather than frozen. He was not only a thinker, he was a question asked in the presence of another human being. And there is something soft in that image, almost like a quiet room where two people are awake while the rest of the house sleeps. One speaks, one listens. The thought turns slowly like a cup in the hand. Nothing dramatic is required. Only patience and the willingness to stay with the question a little longer. If we try to gather Socrates into a few beliefs, one of the clearest is that virtue matters more than pleasure, power, or wealth. But even this needs care because he was not simply dismissing ordinary life. He was asking what gives ordinary life its shape. Virtue for Socrates was not a decorative moral word. It was the health of the soul. A just person is not only admired by others. A just person is, in some deep sense, better off internally. The soul is ordered, the life is aligned. There is less division, less self-betrayal, less of that restless feeling that comes when one thing is said and another is done. He may have believed that the good life is not the same as the easy life. In fact, the easy life can drift far from the good one. Comfort can make a person sleepy in the moral sense. Not physically sleepy, but dull to the demands of conscience. Socrates kept trying to wake people up to their own lives. This did not mean he thought suffering was good in itself. Rather, he believed that the condition of the soul outranks the condition of the body or the favor of the crowd. If a person must choose between doing wrong and being wronged, the first is the greater damage. That is a hard idea, and one that still takes time to sit with. He also seems to have believed that no one willingly chooses evil if they truly know the good. People act badly because they are mistaken, confused, or ruled by desire and fear. This is one of the most distinctive parts of Socratic thought, and one of the most debated. It suggests that education is not merely filling the mind, but clarifying the soul. In that sense, philosophy becomes less like a pile of facts and more like a lantern carried through a corridor. It does not change the structure of the building, but it changes what can be seen there. The corners, the doors, the uneven floor. You walk more carefully when the light is honest. Socrates believed that a human being should strive toward excellence of character, not perfection perhaps, but aspiration, a habit of self-scrutiny, a refusal to live mechanically. The question is not just what do I want, but what should I want? The difference between the two can quietly shape a life. There is a gentle seriousness in this. He did not seem interested in endless abstraction for its own sake. He wanted philosophy to touch conduct. If someone claimed to know about courage, they should be able to live courageously. If they claimed to know about justice, they should act justly. Ideas were accountable. That accountability may be one reason he has remained so compelling for so long. He gives us the sense that thought is not a private luxury. It is a form of responsibility. And responsibility, handled well, can be a quiet thing, steady, unshowy, almost like carrying water carefully in both hands. In the evenings of the mind, perhaps this is a comforting thought, that we do not need to solve everything at once. We need only keep looking honestly at what kind of people we are becoming, and what kind of life our choices are assembling around us piece by piece. There is a famous story, told most vividly by Plato, that Socrates was associated with the oracle at Delphi. A friend allegedly asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the answer said no. Socrates, hearing this, did not take it as a simple compliment. Instead, he treated it as a puzzle. If he was wise, it seemed it could only be in a strange and humble way. He did not think he possessed all the answers. In fact, he may have thought that his wisdom consisted precisely in recognizing his own ignorance. That is a beautiful paradox, and one that has echoed through centuries. He then supposedly went out and questioned people who were thought to be wise, trying to discover what wisdom actually looked like. He spoke with politicians, poets, and craftsmen. He found that many people knew important things within their own trades, but when it came to broader questions about virtue and life, their confidence often exceeded their understanding. The oracle story is important because it helps explain the tone of Socratic philosophy. He did not present himself as a master descending from above. He moved as someone summoned into inquiry, almost as if the world had told him gently, "Go and find out what wisdom is by looking for its absence." That makes his entire life feel a little like an answer to a question that has no final endpoint. He believed in the pursuit of truth more than in the possession of it. He trusted the practice of inquiry. He trusted the conversation. He trusted the strange dignity of admitting ignorance in public. That kind of honesty is rare in any era. It requires a certain steadiness. A person must be willing to look less impressive in order to become more truthful. Socrates may have believed that this loss of surface authority is not a loss at all, but a kind of gain. If your confidence was false, then losing it is simply clearing the room. His method, later called the Socratic method, became one of the great legacies of Western thought, but in his own life it was not merely a method. It was a way of being, a way of keeping the mind awake, a way of refusing to confuse talk with knowledge. There is something almost nocturnal about it, though not dark in a frightening sense, more like the alertness of someone keeping watch by a window. The city sleeps, but the question remains. The city grows quiet, but the mind notices contradictions. Socrates seems to have believed that truth can be approached only by people who are willing to stay awake long enough to be corrected. And perhaps that is why his life ended as it did, in a trial, in conflict, in the hard border between philosophy and public power. He was not a harmless eccentric. He was a persistent examiner of the people around him, and that made him difficult to ignore. Still, the oracle story gives him a luminous simplicity. He was wise because he knew the limits of wisdom. He believed in that humility, and in the disciplined search it makes possible. In the dark of night, that is a kind of peace too, not certainty but steadiness in the search. Eventually, the city that had listened to Socrates for so long decided that it no longer wanted to listen. His trial is one of the most famous in history, and because it is so famous it can start to feel abstract, almost like a symbol instead of an event. But it was also a human scene, men speaking, accusations, confusion, a crowd, a decision. The charges against him, as they are usually summarized, involved impiety and corrupting the young. Those words sound formal, but the emotional reality was likely more tangled. Socrates had become a public irritation. He embarrassed people. He exposed weakness. He made powerful men look uncertain. In a democracy or any political order, that kind of person is both fascinating and dangerous. What is striking is that Socrates does not seem to have begged for survival by denying who he was. He defended his way of life. He defended the practice of questioning. He defended the idea that he had been doing something valuable for the city, even if the city did not appreciate it. That takes a particular kind of courage, the kind that is not loud. He may have believed that one should not trade truth for safety too easily. The price can become too high. If a person lies to save himself, what exactly has been saved? The body perhaps, the name, but what about the soul, which he considered the more important thing? In Plato's account, Socrates speaks calmly, almost with an unsettling composure. He does not frame death as the final disaster. Instead, he treats it as something that may not be fearful in the way people imagine. Either it is a dreamless sleep, or it is a change and a passing to another place. In both cases, he suggests it need not terrify the wise person. That is one of the most soothing thoughts attached to him, especially in a bedtime hour, not because death is small, but because fear can magnify it beyond proportion. Socrates appears to have believed that if a person has cared for the soul, then death does not have the same power over them. The worst outcome is not bodily ending, but moral ruin. He was sentenced to die, and he accepted the sentence. The story of the cup of hemlock has become almost ceremonial in the mind of history. The room, the silence, the final conversation with friends, the drinking of the poison, the gradual failing of the body. It is one of those scenes that seems to have become very still through retelling, and perhaps that stillness matters. Socrates had spent his life insisting that philosophy was not an ornament to life, but a preparation for living and dying well. In the final scene, he became the shape of that claim. This does not mean he was cheerful in any shallow way. Rather, he was steadfast. He believed in the priority of justice over convenience, the soul over the body, and truth over the desire to be spared. Even now, that belief keeps its quiet force. It asks us, without raising its voice, what we are willing to surrender for comfort. The answer is never simple, but Socrates would probably insist that the question itself is worth keeping near. So what did Socrates believe in, after all, if we try to gather the scattered pieces into a calm shape? He believed in questioning and in the value of admitting ignorance. He believed that the soul matters more than external success. He believed that virtue is central to a good life, and that justice should not be compromised for the sake of comfort or applause. He believed that people should examine themselves honestly, and that conversation can be a path toward truth. He also believed, it seems, that a human being should not be ruled blindly by appetite, reputation, or fear. He believed in reason, but not as a cold machine. Reason, for him, was alive in dialogue, sharpened by humility, and aimed toward a better life. There is no need to force him into a modern slogan. Socrates is not easy to turn into a tidy label. He is more useful than that. He is a reminder that a life can be built around moral seriousness without becoming joyless, and around uncertainty without becoming weak. In some ways, his thought still feels like a small lamp left burning in a room after everyone has gone to bed. It does not illuminate everything. It does not need to. It gives enough light to see the next step and the next question. That may be one reason he continues to return to us, not because he solved all the riddles of life, but because he trained his attention on the right sort of riddle. What is goodness? What is justice? What sort of person am I becoming? These questions are old, but they do not grow tired. If you imagine him now, perhaps not as the marble busts show him, but as a man walking slowly through Athens at dusk, you may get a truer feeling of him. He is listening. He is pausing. He is not afraid of sounding unfinished. He does not seem hurried. He seems to believe that truth deserves time, and that is a deeply comforting idea for a night like this. That wisdom does not always arrive in a flash. Sometimes it arrives as a patient refusal to pretend. Sometimes it arrives as a question asked softly enough that the room can keep breathing. So let the thought of Socrates settle here for a while. Let it be simple. Let it be steady. A man in a city. A question in the air. A life examined carefully and left to echo. And as the night grows deeper, it may be enough to remember this. He believed that a good soul is worth more than an easy life, and that the search for truth, however incomplete, is itself one of the most human things we can do. And yet, even that quiet summary can be opened a little further, as though we were standing beside one of the old Athenian streets after sunset, with the heat leaving the stones and the first lamps being lit. Socrates is often described as if he were only an argument, only a chain of questions, only a figure at the center of philosophy. But he was also a man of a particular city, a particular time, and a particular kind of ancient pressure. The Athens in which he lived was not a serene place. It was brilliant, argumentative, proud, wounded, restless. Its harbors carried goods from many lands. Its public spaces gathered citizens who spoke loudly about justice while carrying private ambitions very close to the heart. The city knew beauty and it knew war. It knew democracy, and it knew how easily a crowd can grow uncertain of itself. That larger world matters because Socrates did not think in a vacuum. He lived after the long shadow of the Persian Wars, after Athens had learned to see itself as a major power, and during a time when the city's confidence was both dazzling and fragile. The Acropolis rose above the life below it. The Parthenon was still a relatively new masterpiece in his time, its stone bright under the Attic sun. In the distance were the islands of the Aegean, the trade routes, the contested frontiers, the memory of loss. People in Athens were surrounded by stories of gods, heroes, and founders, but also by the practical daily concerns of law courts, politics, military service, and household survival. Socrates moved through that world with an odd kind of calm. He was not a king, not a general, not a priest, not even a writer in his own name. He did not leave behind treatises carefully arranged for posterity. What we know of him comes through others, especially Plato and Xenophon, and through a cloud of later memory. That makes him especially interesting because he is partly historical person and partly a carefully tended echo. Some ancient figures arrive to us with monuments. Socrates arrives with conversation. That is a subtle difference, and it changes the atmosphere of his life. We see him less as a statue and more as a voice heard under a portico, in a workshop, beside a public building, or while walking through the dusty brightness of the city. He seems to have belonged to the everyday spaces where thought and ordinary life meet. He asked questions in the marketplace. He spoke with artisans, poets, soldiers, politicians, and young men of wealthy families. He seemed to believe that philosophy should not remain hidden away in a sealed chamber. It should walk among the people like a patient stranger, asking what everyone thinks they already know. There is something quietly ancient about this manner. In many civilizations, wisdom begins in the public square. Not only in Greece, but in the river cities of Mesopotamia, in the temple schools of Egypt, in the courtly traditions of the East, in the remembered sayings of elders gathered near a fire. The human desire to examine life is old, older than any single philosopher. Socrates gave that desire a dramatic form, but he did not invent it from nothing. He inherited a world already full of myths, maxims, debates, and sacred explanations. What he seems to have done was to press on the nerve of it all and ask which claims could truly endure examination. He liked to say, in essence, that he knew nothing with certainty except that he did not know enough. That claim has often been repeated and sometimes misunderstood. It was not a pose of false modesty. It was a disciplined beginning. If you wish to seek truth, you must first be willing to see how much of what passes for confidence is merely habit. The mind, after all, is fond of inherited phrases. It likes shortcuts. It likes to borrow certainty from the crowd. Socrates treated that tendency almost like a natural weather pattern of the soul. One does not curse the weather. One studies it and learns how to move through it. His method was famously conversational. The later tradition calls it the elenchus, a kind of questioning that reveals contradictions in a person's beliefs. It could feel irritating. It could feel embarrassing. It could leave a conversation partner suddenly aware that a cherished opinion had thin foundations, yet the aim was not humiliation for its own sake. The aim was purification. Socrates seemed to believe that false confidence is dangerous because it blocks growth. If you think you already possess wisdom, you may never search for it. The painful moment of not knowing can be the opening through which a truer understanding enters. There is a gentle severity in this. It is not the severity of punishment, but of clarity. He wanted people to become more honest with themselves, and self-honesty is often a quieter task than we imagine. It can require us to sit still with our own motives long enough to notice where vanity begins, where fear enters, where convenience has disguised itself as principle. Such noticing is difficult. It is also strangely soothing when it is done without panic, because the truth, however uncomfortable, has a resting quality that illusion does not. Plato preserved many scenes of Socrates doing this work. In those dialogues, the setting often feels measured and almost dreamlike. A riverbank, a portico, a feast, a prison cell, a gathering after the city has already begun to wind down. The drama comes not from explosions or battles, but from thought under pressure. There is a slow unfolding of definitions. What is courage? What is piety? What is friendship? What is love? What is the good? The conversations begin in ordinary language and gradually move toward the edge of mystery. The mind reaches for an answer and finds a horizon. This horizon is part of Socrates' charm. He is not a philosopher of closed systems. He is a philosopher of questions that remain open because they are too deep to settle quickly. In that sense, he resembles some of the oldest wisdom traditions, in which the final truth is approached by layers of speaking and silence. The ancient world often understood that some realities are not grasped by force. They must be circled, listened for, approached with patience. A temple is not built in one gesture. A myth is not understood at first hearing. A civilization does not reveal itself all at once, and neither does a human soul. There is another quiet aspect of Socrates' beliefs that can be easy to miss if one only remembers the more famous lines. He did not simply value questioning in the abstract. He believed that the examined life is tied to character. Knowledge and virtue were not, for him, separate territories. To know the good was to be moved toward it. This is a profound and delicate claim. It suggests that moral failure often involves some form of ignorance, misseeing, or self-deception. We do wrong not only because we are malicious, but because we do not fully understand what we are doing to ourselves and others. This idea has traveled far. It has been welcomed by some and challenged by others. Human beings often know that something is harmful and do it anyway. The heart does not always obey insight immediately. Still, Socrates' belief remains appealing because it preserves hope. It says that wisdom matters not merely as decoration, but as a healing power. If the soul can be made more truthful, the life that follows may become more just. He was also interested in the soul in a way that feels both ancient and intimate. The soul, in his thought, is not merely a ghostly afterimage of a person. It is the inner life, the center of moral being, the thing one must care for above wealth, status, and bodily comfort. Ancient Greeks had many ideas about the soul, and later philosophies would transform and refine those ideas in countless ways. Yet in Socrates, the care of the soul becomes almost urgent. He seems to ask whether we are tending the deepest part of ourselves or merely polishing the surface. This question can still follow a person quietly through the evening. To care for the soul is not necessarily a grand religious gesture, though it may become that for some. It can also mean taking seriously the quality of one's thoughts, habits, and choices. It can mean resisting the impulse to live only for applause. It can mean allowing silence to expose what noise had concealed. There is a stillness in such a life, and perhaps that stillness is one reason Socrates feels so suitable to bedtime reflection. He believed that the soul's well-being matters in ways that are not captured by ordinary success. That can be a very calming idea if one has spent too much time measuring life by external standards alone. At the same time, Socrates was no dreamy retiree removed from public affairs. He was born into the political and military world of his city. He served as a hoplite, as citizen soldiers did, and his life intersected with the harsh realities of Athenian history. The Peloponnesian War, which dragged on for decades, changed everything around him. Cities were tested, alliances shifted, plague swept through Athens, and political confidence cracked. The great age of Pericles did not remain untouched. Some of the city's finest hopes were crushed by siege, defeat, and internal disorder. Socrates lived through all this, and his questions must have sounded differently in a city that had seen so much loss. A war changes what people are willing to believe. It changes how they talk about justice. It can make public life suspicious and private life anxious. In such conditions, a figure who asks people to define courage, fairness, and good government may seem either necessary or intolerable. Socrates seems to have been both. His manner annoyed some of his contemporaries because he exposed pretension, and pretension is often most fragile in times of uncertainty. If a city is already uneasy, a man who continually reveals uncertainty can appear threatening. He may be read as a healer or as a destabilizer. Sometimes both are true. The ancient sources present him as strange in appearance and habits. He was not celebrated for physical beauty. He dressed simply. He could stand motionless in thought for long periods. He could also drink, endure hardship, and remain calm in conditions that would have shaken many others. These details matter because they create a human texture. He was not an abstract principle. He was a presence. Ancient Athens, with its statues, theatres, festivals, and crowded civic life, must have seemed an especially lively environment for a man who spent so much time disturbing ordinary assumptions. One imagines him in the midst of bronze, stone, smoke, argument, and rumour, asking someone what justice really is while the city bustled around them. The city itself had layers beneath layers. Athens was built upon older memory, and beneath its classical splendour lay the archaeology of earlier ages. Long before Socrates, the Greek world had been shaped by Mycenaean palaces, by the still more distant and half-legendary time reflected in Homer, by forgotten local cults and shrines, by seaborne exchanges with Crete, Anatolia, and beyond. The very myths the Greeks told about themselves were full of vanished cities and ruined houses. The story of Troy, whether history, memory, or poetic fusion of both, hovered like a ghost over the Greek imagination. Socrates lived after that world of heroic legend had already become old, but he inherited its language of honor, shame, duty, and fate. He reworked the ancient inheritance into philosophical inquiry. That reworking is part of what gives his life such a layered feel. He did not reject myth as though it were useless. Rather, he lived in a culture where myth and reason coexisted in complex ways. The Greek world was never simply mythical before becoming rational. It was richer than that. Temples stood near law courts. Festivals honored gods while dramatists explored human dilemmas. Oracles still spoke at Delphi. Stories of Athene, Apollo, Dionysus, and the older powers of earth and sea remained near at hand. Socrates himself famously referred to a divine sign, a kind of inner warning or guidance, the daemonion, which restrained him from certain actions. That detail alone reminds us that his rationality was not a modern secular one. It was a philosophical life, still lived in proximity to the sacred and the mysterious. There is something delicate about that. He questioned traditional belief, yet did not simply strip the world of wonder. The divine in his case does not vanish into mechanism. It remains subtle, ambiguous, and close. It is not the thunder of Olympus, but a quiet inward caution. This feels almost like a myth transformed into conscience. Ancient people often understood moral life through signs, omens, and divine relationships. Socrates internalized some of that atmosphere and brought it into dialogue with reason. The result is neither superstition nor modern skepticism, but a poised and unsettled middle ground. One might imagine in the late afternoon light the philosophers and poets of Athens drifting through the same courtyards. The city had its tragedies, and tragedy was not merely entertainment. It was a civic art form, a place where the city could watch itself break and ask why. In the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, human beings contend with divine law, inherited curses, family loyalties, and the stubborn structure of fate. Socrates belongs to that same broad ancient conversation, even if he speaks in prose rather than verse. His questions also ask what a person owes to justice, to the city, and to the unseen order of the world. The difference is that he presses the inquiry one level deeper, toward definitions and principles. He also seems to have believed in the discipline of not knowing how much one thinks one knows. This is a very old kind of wisdom, found in many places. The oracle at Delphi, according to the famous story, declared no one wiser than Socrates. He took that not as praise of his possession of knowledge, but as confirmation that his wisdom lay in recognizing his own limits. Know thyself, inscribed at Delphi, became one of the great phrases of the ancient world. Socrates appears to have taken such inscriptions seriously, but not mechanically. He asked what self-knowledge means if one is continually deceived by pride, custom, or social performance. To know oneself may require the uncomfortable labor of self-examination. The old sanctuary at Delphi, set on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, still seems in the imagination to belong to a landscape of mist, cedar, and distant authority. Pilgrims traveled there from across the Greek world. They brought questions to Apollo. They received responses that were often cryptic. Ancient wisdom often spoke in riddles because life itself does. Socrates' own manner is in some ways Delphic. He is close to the oracle in spirit, not because he delivers final answers, but because he compels interpretation. He leaves room for thought to continue after the words are gone. That continuing thought is one of the gentlest gifts a philosopher can leave behind. It does not force the mind into a rigid shape. It makes the mind more attentive, more awake, more patient with complexity. Socrates cared about this patient awakening. He thought that people should not let rhetoric substitute for reality. In democratic Athens, persuasive speech was powerful. Orators could shape assemblies. Sophists could teach techniques of argument, sometimes focusing on winning rather than discovering. Socrates stood in relation to that culture as both participant and critic. He knew the force of language. He used it skillfully. But he also suspected that language can become a mask if it is not anchored in truth. This suspicion remains relevant, though it does not need to be forced into the present. It is enough to note that people in every age can become impressed by eloquence without substance. Ancient Athens had its versions of public relations, prestige, and fashionable opinion. Socrates' questions were a way of clearing the air. What do you mean by that? Can you define it? Is your answer consistent? Have you actually looked at the thing itself or only at its reputation? Such questions can feel like cool water in a hot room. They also reveal where the room has become stuffy. He was often associated with irony, which is another subtle and interesting feature of his style. Socratic irony is not simply mockery. It is a deliberate and often gentle kind of self-presentation in which the speaker appears less certain than he may actually be in order to draw out the ideas of others. It can be playful, but it can also be morally serious. By refusing to claim easy authority, Socrates forces the conversation to reveal what authority actually consists in. Does the person speaking know or only appear to know? The question is ancient and never loses its relevance. In the dialogues, this irony often creates a soft tension. Socrates says he is ignorant, and yet he guides the conversation with extraordinary skill. He seems to give others space, but then the space itself becomes the instrument of revelation. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is more like a gardener's patience. One does not drag the plant upward. One tends the soil, the light, and the water. The growth must come from within. Socrates believed human understanding works in a similar way. He was also deeply associated with the moral education of the young. This contributed to his eventual trial, though the historical details are complicated and filtered through the literary traditions that survived. Athens accused him of impiety and corrupting the youth. In the background of that accusation were fears about political instability, the memory of men who had betrayed democratic values, and the anxiety of a city struggling to recover its self-respect. Socrates had friends and associates among prominent and controversial figures. The city's judgment was not made in a vacuum. Still, the charge that he had led the young astray tells us something important. He inspired transformation, and transformation unsettles institutions. There is a sadness in that. A city can love its thinkers and still fear them. A society can admire intelligence in the abstract and become suspicious when intelligence asks for moral account. Socrates did not appear to try to flatter his judges. He did not offer the kind of speech that would merely secure survival. The apology, as Plato presents it, is not an apology in the modern sense of regretful self-defense. It is a dignified and surprising explanation of his mission. He speaks as if his life has been assigned to him by a higher responsibility. That responsibility, he suggests, is to question, to awaken, to remind the city that material success is not enough. This creates one of the most famous and moving tensions in all of philosophy. A man who believes the soul is central is condemned by the city that gave him form. A man who insists on self-examination is judged by others who may themselves be unwilling to examine the foundations of their anger. The trial of Socrates has become legendary not only because of the sentence, but because of the deep human pattern it represents. Truth and civic order do not always align. A community may punish the very voice that might have helped it heal. And yet the story is not simply tragic in a dark, closed way. It is also strangely luminous. Socrates does not collapse into bitterness. He does not curse the city. He continues to think, to converse, to remain himself. This is where his belief in virtue becomes most visible. He seems to hold that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, better to preserve the soul's integrity than to cling to life at any price. That is a hard teaching. It is not easy to live, but the hardness is what gives it dignity. He is one of those figures whose calm at the edge of death appears almost like a final act of philosophical architecture. One can feel in the background the old Greek sense of measure. The ancients were fascinated by balance, proportion, limit, and excess. Temples were built with mathematical care. Myths warned about hubris. Tragedies often arise when human beings overstep a boundary and discover that the world is larger than their ambition. Socrates, in his own way, respects limit. He does not claim to master all reality. He does not claim to escape mortality by argument. He accepts that a human being is finite. What he will not accept is the idea that finitude excuses moral laziness. This may be one reason why he still feels so near. He is ancient, and yet the essential problem remains current. How shall a finite person live well? What should be prized? What should be refused? What is the right relationship between comfort and conscience? These questions are never exhausted. They return in different clothes, under different political systems, in different empires, under different skies. They are as old as the cities of Sumer, as the inscriptions of Egypt, as the great road networks of Persia, as the debating halls of India, as the wandering teachers of China. Every civilization must at some point ask what a good human life is. Socrates became one of the West's most enduring voices for that question, but the question itself belongs to everyone who has ever paused before choosing. If we lean into that wider human history, Socrates appears as part of a long lineage of seekers. Before him and around him, the world was full of teachers, seers, lawgivers, and storytellers. In Mesopotamia, scribes copied wisdom texts that reflected on justice, suffering, and the limits of human control. In Egypt, moral instruction was often linked to cosmic order, to the rightness of living in harmony with Ma'at, the principle of balance and truth. Across the Mediterranean, sailors carried stories of gods, omens, and heroic endurance. On the hills and islands of Greece, local cults remembered ancient deities and buried kings. Socrates did not stand outside this world. He stood in the middle of it, and by his questions he helped turn inherited wisdom into examined wisdom. There is in that transformation something almost like the gradual clearing of a sky after rain. The clouds do not vanish all at once. They thin, light appears in patches, shapes become clearer. A road, a roofline, a tree, a doorway. Socrates' philosophy works in this way. It does not give the whole landscape at once. It clarifies by degrees. The mind sees more accurately, not because mystery disappears, but because confusion is reduced. And yet mystery remains. Socrates himself seems to have recognized this. He did not pretend that human beings could fully know the gods or the ultimate structure of reality. He did not solve death. He did not eliminate sorrow. He did not abolish political conflict. What he offered was a way of remaining inwardly aligned with the good even in uncertainty. That is perhaps as much as any mortal can hope to do. His influence spread through Plato, then through Aristotle in a different register, and then through centuries of thinkers who continued to argue with him, admire him, or reshape him. Christian writers found in Socrates a prefiguration of moral seriousness. Renaissance humanists found in him a model of inquiry. Modern philosophers return to him as both origin and challenge, yet the figure they meet remains strangely unpossessable. He resists being turned into doctrine alone. He is most alive when he is speaking, asking, interrupting, clarifying, and refusing complacency. One can imagine that if he were sitting now in a quiet room, he would not be interested in being admired. He would ask what we mean by admiration. He might ask whether admiration leads to action, whether action leads to virtue, whether virtue can be taught, and whether anyone who claims to teach it truly understands it. This is not to make him sound severe in a cold way. There is warmth in genuine philosophical attention. To take another person's soul seriously is a kind of respect. Socrates may have been difficult, but the difficulty itself came from care. That care extends to the dialogue form itself. Conversation at its best is a shared slowness. Each speaker waits. Each thought is tested in the presence of another mind. Ancient conversation had many settings for this: shaded courtyards, symposia, porticos, public walks, household gatherings. In Greek culture, the symposium especially carried a distinctive atmosphere, a mixture of wine, poetry, memory, and debate. It was not always calm, of course. Human beings have always brought their appetites with them into social life, but the best conversations can sometimes turn that mingling into a sort of reflective light. Socrates appears often in such settings, not as a mere reveller, but as the one who tilts the evening toward meaning. This is useful to remember because philosophy is sometimes imagined as remote from ordinary life. Socrates did not see it that way. For him, philosophy entered daily conversation. It asked what kind of friend one should be, what sort of leader, what sort of citizen, what sort of lover, what sort of listener. It was not separate from ethics or politics or personal conduct. It was woven through them. In this sense, his thought resembles the older civic wisdom of city-states and kingdoms that knew a ruler was judged not only by territory held, but by the quality of order created. The good life is not merely private success. It has a public and relational dimension. There is also an elegance in the way Socrates treats the act of questioning as a form of service. He does not present himself as an oracle with all the answers. He serves the city by disturbing its false confidence. That is not always appreciated. The one who points out dust in a room may be thanked or re-scented, but if the dust is not noticed, it settles deeper. Socrates' questions lift things into the light. Some can then be cleaned. Others are revealed as shadows mistaken for objects. The process is often uncomfortable, but in the long run it can be liberating. His life ended, as we know, in a prison cell after conviction by the Athenian court. The details have become part of the world's memory. Friends came to him. The atmosphere was heavy but lucid. In Plato's Phaedo, the conversation turns toward the immortality of the soul. Socrates discusses death not as a horror to be fled, but as a transition to be understood within a larger philosophical frame. Whether one accepts the arguments or not, the tone is unmistakable. It is not frantic, it is measured. The room seems to grow still around the conversation. And perhaps that stillness has made Socrates especially available to later ages. Different people have found in him different things. Some have found the champion of reason, some the martyr for conscience, some the teacher of irony, some the enemy of shallow rhetoric, some the man who made philosophy personal and moral. These are not mutually exclusive. Like the broken reflections in an ancient basin of water, each catches a different angle of the same surface. It is also worth remembering that the world which judged him has vanished. The political structures of classical Athens are gone. The assembly no longer gathers in the same way. The temples are ruins, the battles are over, the languages have changed and spread. Yet Socrates remains because the problems he touched do not vanish. Human beings still seek honor, still fear disgrace, still avoid uncomfortable truths, still want to be told they are already wise. Human beings still have the choice between learning and performing, between becoming and appearing, between justice and convenience. The questions are old, and in that old age they become strangely restful, like familiar stars. When one thinks of ancient wisdom, it is easy to picture it as static, but it was often discovered through movement. Traders crossed seas, pilgrims walked to sanctuaries, teachers wandered, scrolls traveled from one city to another. Ideas were carried in memory long before they were copied into libraries. Socrates' own life feels mobile in that same modest way. He walked, he conversed, he asked. He did not appear to need a throne or a library to be himself. The agora, the gymnasium, the street, the dining room, the prison cell, these were enough. There is something humbling in that. Truth, or the search for it, does not always require grandeur. Sometimes it only requires attention. Attention is one of the deepest virtues in his philosophy, though it is rarely named as such. To attend carefully is to honor reality as it is, not as one wishes it to be. It is to resist sleepwalking through one's own mind. It is to let a question remain present long enough to change you. This is a beautiful thought for the night, because bedtime itself asks for a kind of surrendering attention. One lets the day go. One allows the edges of thought to soften, yet one can still keep a small lamp of reflection burning quietly without strain. Socrates invites that sort of lamp, not a harsh interrogation, not a restless philosophical battle. Just a steady curiosity. What is worth loving? What is worth fearing? What is worth choosing when no one is watching? Those are the quieter questions beneath the louder ones. They shape the soul over time. And if we let our imagination travel one step farther, beyond Athens, beyond the marble and the courts, we can place Socrates in the broader map of the ancient world. To the east, empires rose and fell. In Persia, kings ruled vast territories with administrative care and ceremonial grandeur. In Egypt, old dynasties had already become memory, and the river still carried its timeless promise. Across the seas, Phoenician ships moved through commerce and colonization. In far-off lands, languages that Socrates never heard were forming poems, laws, and rituals that also tried to answer human questions. The world was already ancient when he lived. His Athens was one bright district in a much larger human archipelago. That perspective can be soothing. It reminds us that no single age owns the search for meaning. Socrates is a remarkable node in a long chain, not the whole chain. He is one voice among many that have helped people think about justice, virtue, and the soul. The particularity of his voice is part of what makes him memorable. He is clear without being simple, serious without being pompous, skeptical without being empty. He can be read in a hurry, but he is best received slowly. Slowly is a good word for him. Slowly asking, slowly answering, slowly becoming the kind of person who can live truthfully. His life suggests that wisdom is not a trophy but a discipline. It is not sealed away in a final statement. It is practiced in the everyday moments where one chooses honesty over performance, courage over avoidance, and patience over certainty. That is a quiet kind of heroism, and perhaps the ancient world understood it better than we sometimes do. For the ancients were often deeply aware of time's erosion. They knew that cities disappear, empires crumble, famous names become inscriptions on weathered stone, the harbor silts up, the temple roof falls, the wall is dismantled, the grave are forgotten, and yet ideas, if they are sufficiently rooted in human nature, continue to speak. Socrates' ideas have crossed more than 2 millennia, not because they solve every problem, but because they begin where every thoughtful life must begin, with the question of what sort of person one is becoming. There is a tenderness in that beginning. It does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty. It does not demand certainty. It asks for willingness. It does not demand that the night be banished. It asks only that we not mistake the night for final truth. There is, after all, a dawn waiting somewhere beyond it, as there was beyond the Athenian evenings when Socrates walked home through the streets, perhaps speaking to a companion, perhaps pausing beneath the stars, perhaps turning over some small question that would grow larger by morning. In the old world, stars were not merely decorations in a sky. They were guides, calendars, stories, and mysteries. Sailors read them, farmers watched them, poets placed gods among them, philosophers looked up and wondered at order. Socrates, though so closely tied to earthly conversation, belongs to that same contemplative habit. He reminds us that a human being can live on the ground and still think about what is above, beyond, and within. He reminds us that humility is not smallness. It is a fitting size before reality. So if the mind is now growing tired, let it rest near that thought. Socrates believed that the examined life is worth living, not because examination is harsh, but because it is honest. He believed that the soul deserves care, that virtue deserves priority, and that ignorance becomes less dangerous when it is admitted. He believed that a city and a person both need scrutiny. He believed that death should not frighten the just into falsehood. And he believed, in a way that still feels calm and brave, that one should not trade integrity for safety too quickly. Let that be the last light for a while, a small and steady one. The questions may remain unanswered tonight, and that is all right. Ancient questions often prefer to sleep beside us rather than be solved immediately. Socrates would probably understand that. He might even approve of the silence that follows a sincere inquiry, so the room can soften now. The old streets of Athens can fade. The court, the prison, the harbour, the market, the shrine at Delphi, the bright stones of the Acropolis, all can drift farther away into the dark. What remains is simple enough: a human being asking what goodness is, another human being listening, the long, patient work of thought, the quiet dignity of not pretending to know what one does not know. And in that quiet dignity there is something nearly timeless, something that belongs not only to ancient Greece, but to any soul willing at the edge of sleep to be gently honest with itself. And perhaps that is why Socrates continues to feel near, even now, in a world so different from his own. His Athens is long gone. The streets he knew have changed beyond recognition. The voices in the agora have become echoes. Yet the inner life he insisted upon is still here, still waiting in each generation for someone to notice it. A person may live among machines, schedules, glass towers, electric light, and still face the same ancient inward question: what is worth wanting? What is worth fearing? What is worth doing with the short, unrepeatable span of a human life? The old philosophers sometimes imagined the soul as something that could be cared for the way one tends a garden in dry weather. Not with dramatic force, but with steady attention. Water in the morning, a little clearing away of weeds, a careful look at what has taken root. Socrates seems to belong to that patient art. He does not offer a fireworks display of doctrine. He offers a discipline of attention. He asks that we look clearly and that we keep looking when the first easy answer has grown thin. This is one of the gentler things about him. He is often remembered as argumentative, but argument in his case was meant to awaken. He wanted the mind to become less sleepy in daylight, not more restless at night. He wanted hidden assumptions to be brought into the open, where they could be examined without shame. For many people, this can feel unsettling at first, yet there is also comfort in it. There is comfort in knowing that confusion need not be a permanent state, only a place from which one begins. Ancient harbours, after all, were not always calm. Winds shifted, waves rose, ships waited, and still the journey, when it began, moved forward by degrees. To imagine Socrates in Athens is to imagine a city alive with argument and ritual, with markets and processions, with polished marble and dust. It was a place of temples, but also a place of speech. Public life there was not hidden away in distant offices. It spilled into squares, courts, banquets, gymnasiums, and roadside conversations. Philosophy, in that setting, did not live in silence alone. It walked among ordinary people. It took shape in questions asked under open sky. It belonged to the city as much as any statue or wall, and perhaps more so because statues can crumble while questions remain. There is something quietly moving about the fact that Socrates left nothing written in his own hand. No treatise, no polished manual, no formal autobiography. His thought survives through other voices, through memories filtered by students, critics, admirers, and dramatists. This gives his image a particular fragility. He appears to us almost like a figure seen through thin morning mist above a river, never fully seized, always partly inferred. And yet this uncertainty suits him in a strange way. He was a man who made not knowing central to wisdom. It is fitting that even now, centuries later, we encounter him as a presence assembled from fragments, questions, and reverent descriptions. The ancient world was full of such fragments, broken tablets, lost scrolls, weathered names, reused stones. A temple at one time becomes a quarry at another. A city once rich with language becomes a field of ruins where wild grass grows between foundations. The past does not preserve itself kindly. It erases and covers and rearranges. But sometimes against that great quiet force a few things remain: a line of poetry, a carved face, a sentence from a dialogue, a belief repeated by another hand. Socrates survives in that manner, not as a complete monument, but as a voice that still reaches us across the slow collapse of centuries. And if we listen softly, we can hear more than doctrine. We can hear temperament, we can hear restraint. Socrates did not seem to rush toward grand declarations when a measured question would do. He allowed conversation to unfold. He let a thought breathe. He recognized that the human mind often benefits from being led rather than commanded. There is a kindness in that. Real learning, after all, rarely arrives as a thunderclap. More often it comes like evening light moving gradually across a wall, showing what had been there all along. He also reminds us that intelligence and virtue are not the same as display. In many eras, and perhaps especially in ours, cleverness can become a kind of performance. It can dress itself in certainty and hurry. Socrates cuts against that habit. He seems almost indifferent to appearing impressive. The better aim, in his view, was to become better. This difference matters. A beautiful answer may shine for a moment, but a sincere search can reshape a life. And a life, unlike a speech, is something one must inhabit all the way to the end. The old Greeks understood the gravity of this in a deeply physical world. They lived close to weather, stone, sea, and harvest. They knew that bodies tire, ships sink, and harvests depend on rains beyond human control. They knew also that honors are temporary. A victor's crown withers. A triumphal song ends. A general's name may be praised in one season and condemned in another. This awareness of impermanence may have helped make their thought so enduring. When a civilization knows that all visible things pass, it often becomes more attentive to what might outlast them. Socrates, in this sense, stands near the threshold between what fades and what remains. His body vanished, as all bodies do. His city changed. His interlocutors died. Even the most famous details of his life come down to us through mediation. Yet his central concern, that one should care for the soul and not merely for appearances, has not aged. It still feels unexpectedly direct. It reaches across time without decoration. It asks us to pause in the middle of our own rushing and consider the state of our inward life as one might consider the condition of a house before winter. There is an ancient dignity in such attention. Not severity, exactly. Not coldness, dignity. To live thoughtfully was for Socrates not to separate oneself from human life, but to enter it more fully. He spoke with craftsmen, politicians, poets, soldiers, and young men at the beginning of their futures. He seemed to know that wisdom, if it exists at all, should not be trapped in one class, one profession, or one pose. It must pass among people. It must test itself against daily reality. A theory about justice means little if it cannot be carried into a courtroom, a family, a neighborhood, or a city under strain. And so his famous questioning was never merely an abstract game. It touched on conduct, responsibility, courage, friendship, temperance, and the strange difficulty of living well among others. These are not grand themes in the theatrical sense. They are quieter than that. They are the themes that shape kitchens, councils, bedsides, marketplaces, and final hours. They decide whether a promise is kept, whether a rumor is repeated, whether a fear is obeyed, whether a weaker person is treated with care. The old world, with all its marble and myth, was built from such small decisions, just as every world is. The stories surrounding Socrates also preserve the atmosphere of a time when philosophy and religion still moved close together, though not always comfortably. The oracle at Delphi, with its sacred authority and strange riddling speech, forms part of his legend. A pronouncement from a god, an interpretation by humans, and then a life shaped by trying to understand what the divine statement might mean. There is something almost dreamlike in this. Delphi itself was a place of mountain air and solemn stone, of priestly answers wrapped in ambiguity. Across the ancient world, people sought signs there. Kings sent envoys, city-states consulted, individuals hoped for guidance. And Socrates, according to the tradition, turned that oracle's statement into a philosophical path. It is easy to imagine him thinking about it later in the day, perhaps while walking under hard sunlight or shaded colonnades. If no one is wiser than he, what could that mean? Not that he possesses hidden knowledge. Rather, perhaps, that he is aware of his ignorance in a way others are not. This is a beautiful reversal. Wisdom begins not in possession, but in lucidity. The wise person is not the one who has all answers, but the one who can endure the shape of uncertainty without lying about it. This is a useful thought to carry toward sleep. The day often asks so much of certainty. It asks for decisions, responses, estimates, deadlines, conclusions. But the deeper self does not always need to follow the same pace. There are questions that mature slowly, like fruit in heat, and some truths can only be approached when the mind is no longer forced to perform. Night is generous in that way. It permits unfinished thought. It lets a person set down what cannot yet be solved. Socrates, who spent so much of his life in conversation, might have appreciated that gentle pause between one inquiry and the next. The ancient city around him would have sounded different from the modern world, but not entirely unfamiliar. There would have been footsteps on stone, the calls of sellers, the low murmur of discussion, the occasional cry from an animal being led through a street, the rustle of robes, the sound of tools, the movement of water at a port not far away. The light itself would have been different too, cleaner perhaps, less interrupted by electric glare, more dependent on the sun's angle and the smoke of lamps after dark. Evening in Athens would have arrived with a particular softness, a gradual retreat of heat from the white buildings and dusty paths. Under that sky, a philosopher speaking quietly to a companion might seem less like a public figure and more like a human being among other human beings, trying honestly to understand life before it slipped away. There is no reliable portrait of his face that can capture everything. Ancient likenesses, even when carefully made, always leave something unresolved. The nose, the eyes, the mouth, the baldness or hairline, the particular heaviness or alertness of the brow. We reconstruct the past from surviving forms and then fill in the rest with imagination. Socrates has become one of those faces we know through tradition more than sight, but perhaps that is appropriate. It keeps the emphasis on voice and character rather than on appearance. It reminds us that a person may become memorable not for how he looked, but for how he thought and lived. And living for Socrates involved a willingness to be inconvenient to false comfort. He disturbed complacency. He turned over beliefs like stones to see what lived underneath. This did not make him universally beloved. It rarely does. Cities are often ambivalent toward those who ask hard questions in public. There is admiration mixed with irritation, gratitude mixed with suspicion. A wise voice can feel like a clean wind in a stale room, and sometimes the room prefers its stale warmth. Yet the worth of the wind is unchanged. It refreshes what has grown heavy. The trial of Socrates, remembered by generations, carries its own quiet tragedy. One can imagine the courtroom not as a place of melodrama, but as a place crowded with human fear, political pressure, memory, and confusion. Athens was wounded in those years. War, instability, and civic tension had left their mark. In such climates, suspicion finds fertile ground. A man who questions too much may come to seem dangerous simply because he refuses easy conformity. And yet Socrates remained, by the traditional account, calm enough to keep speaking as himself. There is a particular courage in that, not theatrical bravery, not a soldier's charge, the slower courage of integrity under judgment. Ancient trials were not like modern abstractions. They were deeply civic, almost ritual events in which the fate of a person and the self-image of a city could become tangled together. A verdict could carry the weight of public memory. In Socrates' case, the result became part of philosophy's history, but at the moment itself it must have been a human and immediate thing. Men voting, voices rising, the atmosphere thick with the gravity of collective decision. One can imagine the stone steps, the summer air, the tension of the crowd. And within that scene, Socrates speaking with a steadiness that has echoed ever since. His death, too, has been remembered with unusual resonance. Not because it was ordinary, but because it was composed, almost ceremonial in its calm. The cup, the final conversation, the fading of sensation. In the Platonic telling, death is faced not with frenzy, but with a kind of philosophical patience. This has made the scene linger in the imagination of later ages. People return to it because it offers an image of how a human being might meet the end without surrendering the moral shape of the life that preceded it. That is no small thing. Many stories celebrate conquest. Socrates' last scene celebrates consistency. There is a deep antiquity in that kind of consistency. The builders of old tombs knew it. The sculptors of funerary figures knew it. The priests who arranged offerings for the dead knew it. A life once closed leaves a form. It may be remembered by name, by image, by ritual, or by the words passed along after burial. Socrates left a form through thought. It is less tangible than a sarcophagus, but perhaps no less durable. Ideas can act like burial chambers for the spirit of a person, preserving shape across time in a way that stone alone cannot. When thinking of Socrates, it is helpful sometimes to place him among the wider ancient world rather than isolate him from it. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, other civilizations were developing their own wisdom traditions, myths and records. In Egypt, priestly knowledge carried the memory of older dynasties and sacred geometry. In Mesopotamia, cities of brick rose and fell along rivers where writing itself had first taken some of its early forms. In Persia, imperial power stretched across diverse peoples and landscapes. On distant coasts, sailors carried stories, metals, and goods from island to island. Humanity was already a network of inquiry and exchange. Socrates belongs to one local branch of that greater, older tree. This broader view gives a gentler shape to intellectual history. Socrates was not a solitary lightning strike in an otherwise empty sky. He was part of a long human habit of asking what is true, what is just, what should be honored, what should be feared, and how one should live. Those questions are older than any single philosopher. They can be heard in temple hymns, law codes, mythic dialogues, royal inscriptions, and the advice of elders to children. What Socrates did was sharpen them, refine them, and make them central to public self-understanding. He made the act of questioning itself visible as a form of care. And perhaps care is the word to hold close as the mind starts to drift, to care for truth, to care for one's own soul, to care enough to be honest. These things sound simple, but they are among the hardest. A person can spend years busying themselves with externals and still never settle the inward matter. Socrates' life suggests that philosophy begins when one stops pretending that external success automatically provides internal health. Wealth may enlarge options, reputation may bring attention, power may bring influence, but none of these alone can teach a person how to be good. That lesson must be chosen, examined, and practiced. The quietness of this idea is striking. Socrates did not leave behind a grand empire, nor a vast building program, nor an archive of possessions. What he left was a mode of attention. That may be one of the lightest things in the world and also one of the most enduring. Attention changes the quality of a day. It can make an ordinary act meaningful. It can soften cruelty by making one notice another person more fully. It can interrupt automatic habits long enough for conscience to speak. In this way, Socrates' influence is not only philosophical, it is moral and everyday. It reaches into the manner of listening, the pace of speaking, the willingness to revise oneself. The ancient dialogues often show this movement from confusion toward clearer confusion, if one might call it that. A person thinks he knows what courage is, then realizes the definition is insufficient. He thinks justice is obvious, then finds that examples refuse to stay within simple boundaries. He thinks piety can be neatly named, and then the name slips away. These failures are not failures in the usual sense. They are openings. They make room for a more careful relation to reality. Socrates is patient with this process. He does not seem embarrassed by the collapse of false certainty. He seems to expect it, and because he expects it, he is able to use it. This is a rare and useful temperament. Many people fear the moment when an answer falls apart, but Socrates seems to have understood that such a moment can be the beginning of wisdom. One might compare it to an old wall whose plaster peels away, revealing older layers underneath. The first surface may have looked finished, but the earlier strata tell a longer story. The human mind has layers too. Beneath a quick opinion may lie habit, memory, inherited speech, fear, admiration, or social pressure. To ask carefully is to uncover those layers without cruelty. The ancients did not have modern neuroscience, but they knew something about the complexity of the self. They knew that desire can be divided, that pride can obscure judgment, that shame can distort memory, that habit can become a second nature. Socrates spoke into that complexity with a remarkably simple insistence: know yourself. Yet that simplicity is deceptive, like a small stone in the hand that turns out to be carved from a mountain's older core. To know oneself is not to indulge oneself. It is not to admire oneself. It is to see one's motives clearly enough to begin the work of aligning them with the good. In the stillness of bedtime, this can feel less like a command than a reassurance. There is room, even now, for the inward life to become clearer. No dramatic transformation is required before sleep, only a little honesty, a little release of the day's tight grip, a willingness to admit where one does not know. Socrates might have considered that a beginning worthy of respect. He would likely prefer a modest true thing to a grand false one. There is also a strange beauty in the relation between memory and loss in his story. Almost everything physical is gone. The wood of the prison has vanished, the cup is gone, the courtroom is gone, the Athenian world in its classical form is gone, yet because the questions remain alive, the man remains alive in thought. Not literally, of course, but in the human sense that matters for culture and conscience. A thinker can outlast stone if the mind keeps returning to him in moments of need. That is one of the oldest forms of immortality, quieter than myth but sometimes more intimate. For the old myths too were often about survival through memory. Heroes entered the underworld. Names were sung by poets so they would not disappear. Ancestors were honored so the living would not become rootless. Socrates occupies a place beside these traditions, though in a different register. He is not a god, not a conqueror, not a tragic king. He is a questioner. His afterlife is therefore intellectual rather than divine. He survives in the conscience of readers, in the classrooms of centuries, in the private moments when a person asks whether a thought is merely convenient or actually true. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps a life does not need monumentality to be great. Perhaps it only needs coherence, courage, and a refusal to abandon the soul to habit. Socrates seems to suggest that greatness can be humble. It can appear in the ability to stand still and say, in effect, I do not yet know, but I am willing to seek. In a culture hungry for swift answers, this can sound almost radical, yet it is one of the oldest and most human statements available. The night deepens around such thoughts without force. The house remains quiet. The body grows more comfortable in its weight. The mind, if it is allowed, may set down one question and then another. Socrates would not rush this process. He would know that thought has its own seasons. There is a time to press, a time to clarify, a time to release. Sleep belongs to that last time. It is not a surrender of thought, but a gentle loosening of its grip. And if an idea is good, it will still be there tomorrow, perhaps a little clearer for having rested. There are old cities beneath old cities, layers of civilization beneath layers of dust. Archaeologists uncover them slowly, brush by brush, seeking pottery shards, foundations, inscriptions, the remains of walls and roads. The world in which Socrates lived is now one such layer, and beneath it are older ones still. Bronze Age palaces, Mycenaean tombs, Minoan frescoes, Neolithic settlements, river valleys where no written names survive. Human history is a deep arrangement of vanished days. Socrates stands on one of its terraces, close enough to us that we can still hear him, far enough away that he feels almost like a voice rising from beneath the earth. This image suits him. He belongs to the past, but not in a sealed or dusty way. He belongs as a question belongs, moving from one age to another, asking to be considered anew. It is not necessary to agree with every detail traditionally attached to him in order to feel the force of his example. Even the uncertainty around him adds a kind of depth. We know enough to sense the shape of the person, but not so much that the mystery disappears. In that sense, he resembles so many figures from antiquity whose outlines are preserved by a few surviving texts, a handful of artifacts, and the steady labor of interpretation. And interpretation itself can be an act of care. To read the past slowly is to honor it. To resist flattening it into slogans is to let it remain human. Socrates, who loved conversation, would likely appreciate this. He understood that truth often reveals itself in the meeting between a question and a thoughtful reply. The mind is not a machine that simply extracts certainty. It is a living thing shaped by context, language, memory, and ethical stance. The best questions do not merely demand information. They rearrange the soul, so there is no need to hurry now. The ancient harbor is far away. The agora is quiet. The temple steps are cooling in the dusk. Somewhere beyond the city, fields rest under stars. Somewhere a lamp is being lit. Somewhere a student listens. Somewhere a teacher asks one more careful question. The scene is old, but it never entirely disappears. It returns whenever a human being tries to live honestly. And in the end, that may be Socrates' most lasting belief, that the inward work matters, that the good life cannot be outsourced, that virtue requires attention, and that the soul must not be neglected in the chase for outward success. He believed that wisdom begins in humility and grows through dialogue. He believed that an unexamined life is incomplete. He believed that truth is worth the discomfort it sometimes brings. He believed that death need not cancel integrity. He believed above all that one should remain faithful to what is best in oneself, even when it is lonely. Let those beliefs settle now like dust in moonlight, not heavy, not urgent, simply present. The room is quiet. The questions have grown soft. The ancient city has slipped farther into memory. And the calm that remains is its own kind of understanding, a hush in which thought and rest can meet without conflict. So the mind may let go gradually and without effort. The old philosopher's voice can fade into the distance, not lost, only resting. The examined life can wait until morning. The stars are still there as they were over Athens, and as they were over older cities before Athens, and as they will be over places we will never know by name. Beneath them all, human beings continue to wonder, to listen, to learn, and to sleep. And in that sleep, there is no shame in not knowing everything. There is only the gentle, ancient dignity of having cared enough to ask. In that same spirit, it is perhaps fitting to remain a little longer with the idea of not knowing. Socrates is often remembered as a thinker of sharp edges, someone who pressed his companions until their confident answers became uncertain. Yet the feeling beneath that pressure was not cruelty. It was a kind of reverence for reality. He seemed to believe that the world is too large, too layered, too old to be reduced too quickly into neat statements. There are cliffs in the sea and chambers under the ground, and there are also hidden chambers in the mind. A person who speaks too soon may mistake the doorway for the whole house. The ancient Greeks were surrounded by reminders of depth. Their landscape held caves, springs, rocky sanctuaries, windy passes, islands that seemed to rise from the water like fragments of a broken story. Behind every visible thing there could be another story, older and more obscure. The olive tree, the well, the road between cities, the boundary stone at the edge of a field, all of them belonged to a world in which the divine and the ordinary were never entirely separate. It is easy to imagine Socrates walking through such a city, attentive not only to speeches in the agora, but to the quiet grammar of the place itself. The call of a bird, the shadow of a column, the way dust gathers in a corner of marble, small things can become teachers when one has learned to look, and perhaps this is one reason his thought still feels alive. It does not float above the earth like a remote formula, it stays close to lived experience. Socrates asks what courage looks like when a person is afraid, what justice means when power is involved, what piety means when custom and conscience do not fully agree, what friendship means when admiration and honesty must be balanced. These are not abstract riddles alone. They are the kinds of questions that rise quietly in ordinary life, often at night, when the day's noise has gone and the mind is finally free to hear itself. The ancient world understood in its own way that such questions could be dangerous. Cities feared disorder, empires feared doubt, households feared disruption. To ask too much might unsettle the familiar arrangements that kept a society moving. Yet Socrates seemed to think that a fragile peace bought by unexamined habit was not true peace at all. Better to feel the discomfort of inquiry than to sleep inside a false certainty. It is a severe idea, but also a merciful one, because it suggests that human beings are not condemned to drift along forever in inherited confusion. They can wake up, examine themselves, and begin again. Still, there is something soft in the very method he used. Conversation is a humane art. One person speaks, another listens, a third question opens a new path, and the thought continues like footsteps on a stone lane. There is no thunder in it, only patience. The pace matters. A genuine dialogue cannot be rushed because understanding ripens slowly. Even disagreement, when handled with care, can become a form of companionship. Two minds may stand across from one another like neighboring lamps, each making the other's shape more visible. This may also help explain why Socrates has been so many different things to so many different ages. To some, he is the martyr of free inquiry. To others, the stern guardian of moral seriousness. To still others, the playful examiner who refuses to let a polished answer remain untested. Each age finds in him a mirror, and each mirror catches a slightly different light. The ancient sources do not settle every detail, and that uncertainty has its own quiet beauty. Like a temple ruin partly buried by soil, he is visible enough to study, but not so complete that imagination has nothing left to do. In the centuries after his death, philosophers continue to return to him as if returning to a spring in dry weather. Plato gave him an almost mythic afterlife in dialogue after dialogue, where his voice carries forward in scenes of argument, irony, and revelation. Xenophon offered another image, gentler and more practical, a Socrates concerned with useful conduct and ordinary virtue. Later generations, reading these portraits, saw not one fixed figure but a whole constellation, and perhaps this is appropriate. Some minds are too large to be captured by a single outline. They become, over time, a region of thought rather than a single point. There is something moving in the fact that Socrates himself wrote nothing. No notebooks survived from his hand, no letters. No private treatise folded away in a library chest. What remains is mediated through others, preserved in memory, transformed by literary art, carried through the fragile chain of transmission. In the ancient world, many things disappeared in this way. Papyrus decayed, cities burned, earthquakes shook walls into rubble. In libraries, one careless fire could erase shelves of accumulated attention. Yet some voices persisted because they were spoken often enough, and because they touched a nerve in the human condition. The loss of so much from antiquity can feel sad if one thinks of it all at once, but it also gives the surviving fragments a special tenderness. A broken statue in a museum invites the mind to lean in. A partial inscription on stone asks to be read slowly. A line of poetry copied by a monk on the edge of a manuscript may carry more emotional weight precisely because it is surrounded by silence. The same is true of Socrates. His absence as an author leaves a space that has remained active for millennia. That space is not empty. It is inhabited by interpretation, argument, memory, and the long echo of his questions. And those questions, in a way, are already part of older human habits. Long before philosophy had a name, people were asking why the world was ordered as it was, why storms came, why the stars moved as they did, why justice seemed to fail then return in another form, why some stories were remembered while others vanished. Mythology offered answers in the language of gods and heroes, of sacred places and recurring fates. Philosophy in the Greek world slowly learned to ask in another register, but it did not erase the older mode. It stood beside it, sometimes in tension, sometimes in inheritance. Socrates lived at a crossroads where the old world of myth still breathed under the new world of argument. This is part of what makes ancient Athens feel so layered. The city was not an isolated island of reason floating above everything else. It was a place of festivals, processions, theatre, civic duty, family custom, naval power, trade, war, memory, and rumour. Its public spaces were alive with speech, yet beyond the marble and the laws there were older currents still. Hills once sacred to local deities, burial grounds where names had long faded, coastal routes used by traders, pirates, and messengers. The city was a human construction, but it sat inside a much older and larger world. Socrates walked through that world with the peculiar awareness of someone who found the visible only half complete. It is easy to imagine the quiet corners of Athens at dawn, a dog sleeping near a doorway, a boy carrying water, smoke rising from a cooking fire, the first light touching a column and warming its pale surface. In such a scene, the difference between the ordinary and the philosophical becomes very small. A question can begin in the market and end in the soul. A conversation about justice may start with a legal matter and end with a reconsideration of what it means to be human. Socrates believed that the inner life and the civic life could not be entirely separated. A city is made of laws but also of character. If the character is neglected, the city trembles. That idea still feels quietly modern, even if it belongs to a far older time. It suggests that public life is never only public. It begins in private habits of honesty, restraint, courage, and attention. A person who has not examined their own motives may perform well in the daylight of reputation and still be poorly prepared for the dusk of conscience. Socrates seems to have known this with unusual seriousness. He wanted people to look at themselves not out of vanity, but out of responsibility. Self-knowledge was not self-absorption. It was an ethical discipline, a way of becoming fit for the demands of living among others. There is also a gentle irony in the fact that one of history's most famous thinkers was often described as physically plain, even awkward. He was said to resemble the carved figures of satyrs in some respects, those half-mythic beings associated with music, mischief, and the untamed edges of the forest. The comparison may have been playful, but it feels revealing too. Socrates did not embody the polished beauty of a tragic hero. He was associated instead with endurance, with wit, with inward discipline, with a face that became memorable because of what it carried, not because of how it looked. Ancient philosophy, for all its abstraction, remained deeply embodied. It was spoken by a man who walked, ate, stood, listened, and endured. One can linger over the image of him in winter, wearing a simple cloak, moving through streets where the rain has darkened the stones. or in summer, pausing beneath an olive tree while the heat gathers in the afternoon, or at the edge of a banquet where a room full of voices slowly quiets as he begins to speak. The surviving portraits differ, but all suggest a certain steadiness. He was not the kind of thinker who rushed to fill silence. He let silence do some of the work. In a room at night, that quality feels especially precious. Silence is not emptiness. It is the space in which a careful thought may settle without being disturbed. And perhaps this is one of the reasons he remains so close to later generations. Human beings often live among distractions, but underneath them there is a persistent desire for clarity. Not total certainty, perhaps, but clarity of purpose, a sense of what truly matters, a way to distinguish the essential from the merely loud. Socrates does not hand that to us in a finished form. He invites us into the labor of finding it. This is demanding, but it can also be restful in a deep way because it returns us to what is real rather than what is merely urgent. The ancient Greek world had many urgent things: wars with Persia, rivalries among city-states, political upheaval, plague, faction, trials, alliances that shifted like weather. Athens itself would come to no deep loss. And yet in the midst of that instability, conversations still happened in courtyards and workshops, on stoops and walking paths. Ideas traveled from person to person like oil lamps being carried through a darkened house. Some of those ideas were political, some practical, some poetic, and some philosophical. Socrates entered that current and altered it. He did not stop the storms of history, but he changed the way some people listened inside them. The story of his trial has always felt particularly haunting. A citizen standing before his fellow citizens, charged with corrupting the young and disrespecting the gods of the city. The scene contains within it a collision of loyalties, to the polis, to conscience, to law, to the spirit of inquiry, to the fragile fabric of collective life. Whatever one makes of the exact legal and moral details, the image remains powerful. A society asks a question about one of its most unsettling voices, and the answer it gives becomes part of the legacy it leaves behind. Such moments occur throughout history. Cities judge their critics. Empires silence their doubters. And later generations return to those judgments, trying to understand what was really being defended and what was really being lost. Socrates' response, as later tradition preserves it, was not the response of someone eager to protect comfort at all costs. He seemed willing to accept the consequences of holding fast to his principles. That willingness has inspired admiration for centuries. It also raises a quiet and difficult question. What does it mean to remain faithful to one's convictions without becoming inflexible or self-righteous? Socrates may have believed that the examined life requires not only courage, but humility. To live well is not to possess every answer. It is to stay obedient to truth as far as one can perceive it, and to remain open when one's own understanding proves incomplete. In this sense, his philosophy has a meditative quality. It encourages inward steadiness. It asks the soul to become more honest, more alert, less divided against itself. There is nothing flashy in this work. It resembles the gradual tidying of a room at dusk, when one folds a blanket, straightens a table, places an object back where it belongs. The mind, too, can be made more orderly by attention. Not perfectly, never finally, but enough to breathe more easily. The ancient Mediterranean itself offers many images of such quiet order and quiet loss. Harbors silt up and change shape. Trade routes move. Shrines fall into ruin. Gods are worshipped in one century and remembered as names in another. Yet beneath the change, certain human gestures repeat. Someone kneels beside a spring. Someone leaves an offering. Someone asks a question about justice. Someone listens. Socrates belongs to this enduring sequence, one among the many figures who remind us that thought is a human practice, as much rooted in place and time as farming or weaving or sailing. And like those practices, philosophy depends on patience. The sailor learns the sea by repeated crossings. The potter learns the clay by repeated touch. The philosopher learns the soul by repeated attention. Socrates knew that one conversation could not exhaust a life, so he kept conversing, or at least the image of him did. The rhythm of questioning and answering became a kind of school without walls, open to the weather of the city. It was not always gentle in content, but its form was intimate. A small group, a few voices, a pause, a new direction. The mind gently turned like a vessel catching light. There is a peace in thinking of the past this way, not as a museum of dead facts, but as a landscape of ongoing human gestures. The names change, the languages change, the gods change, the tools change, but the patient work of trying to understand how to live remains. Socrates asked in a city of stone, but his questions still pass through modern rooms, modern schools, modern streets, and modern nights. A person lying awake may wonder whether success is enough, whether kindness without truth is enough, whether knowledge without virtue is enough, whether a life can be called good if it is merely comfortable. These are old questions. They have traveled a long way. Perhaps they have traveled so far because they are not only questions of philosophy but questions of survival. Human communities need more than material arrangement. They need trust, discernment, and a shared sense of the good. When those things weaken, civilization becomes brittle. Ancient histories are full of examples. Great halls stand empty, kings are forgotten, roads overgrow, scripts become unreadable. What remains often is not the force of power, but the quality of thought, the trace of an idea, the memory of a voice that once challenged people to be better than they had been. Socrates belongs to that kind of survival, and if one listens carefully, there is even a tenderness in his severity. He may have been relentless in argument, but the purpose was not humiliation, it was awakening. He wanted people to see more clearly, to avoid the traps of vanity and habit, to become capable of a more stable joy. That joy would not depend entirely on applause, wealth, or office. It would come from alignment within the self, from a relation to truth that could withstand embarrassment, loss, and time. Such a view is austere, but also strangely comforting. It suggests that one's deepest dignity is not so easily taken away. The ancients understood dignity in many forms. There was civic honor, family honor, military honor, ritual honor, the honor of a poet, the honor of a host, the honor of a guest. But Socrates points toward another kind, quieter and more inward, the dignity of refusing to lie to oneself, the dignity of admitting ignorance, the dignity of remaining morally awake. These are not grand monuments. They are more like a clean lamp flame, steady in a dark room, small but enough to guide the next step. It is pleasant in the imagination to place that lamp in a house overlooking the sea. Outside, the harbor is black and silver under the moon. Inside, a few figures speak in low voices. Perhaps there are clay cups on the table. Perhaps there is the smell of olive oil and warm bread. The conversation moves from politics to virtue, from virtue to the soul, from the soul to the unknown. No one can see the future. No one can stop history from moving toward the long shadow that will one day stretch over Athens. But for that hour or that night, there is inquiry, companionship, and the fragile confidence that truth can be approached if not possessed. And in the centuries after, as empires rose and fell, as Alexandria became a memory, as libraries scattered, as roads changed hands, as temples were converted or abandoned or buried, Socrates kept returning in new forms. Medieval scholars found him through translated fragments and commentaries. Renaissance readers admired him as a figure of moral seriousness. Modern philosophers treated him as an origin point, a provocation, a standard, a problem. Each age made of him something useful and something incomplete. That too is part of his legacy. He teaches not only by what he said, but by how impossible it is to finish saying it. For the sleeper, perhaps this is enough. To rest in the knowledge that some questions are meant to accompany us rather than be conquered. To let the mind become spacious around them. To acknowledge that the ancient world is not gone so completely as it seems. It persists in words, in ideas, in pottery shards, in broken inscriptions, in the geometry of ruins, in the patient labor of scholars, in the echoes carried by education, and in those silent moments when a person suddenly wonders what kind of life is worth living. The night outside may be deep now. The city, whether ancient or modern, has fallen into its quieter layers. Windows are dark, streets are emptied. The sea, if there is one nearby, moves without witness. Somewhere in some other room, another person is reading about long-dead teachers, old cities, forgotten beliefs, and the strange endurance of thought. History continues to breathe slowly. The dead are not present in the ordinary sense, but neither are they entirely absent. Their questions remain among us, patient as stones. So let Socrates rest there in that long interval between memory and forgetting. Let the dialogue soften. Let the arguments lose their edges. Let the great city of Athens recede into amber distance, its columns pale in the last light, its streets becoming quiet channels for wind. Let the old philosopher remain as he has often remained, a man asking one more question and then another, not to disturb peace, but to seek the deeper peace that can only come from truth. And when the mind is ready, it may drift with that question into sleep, not solving it, not abandoning it, only holding it lightly, as one might hold a small lamp while crossing a dark and familiar room.